Good morning. We are on page 413 of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, long Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu, which is the source text, big part of the source text and source material for the end of Hemshech Hayim Beis, which is why we're learning this, to give us background as well as to fill in we'll call it the plot of the narrative that the Rebbe Rashab never concluded, left certain things unfinished, and we can extrapolate and draw from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, where he does continue, and try to understand the bigger picture here. The Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, in turn, is based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the same Dibra Maskil, Mika Hashem Elokeinu, which we learned in Torah, the Maimer and the Beer explanation of that Maimer. So where are we at? We're talking about Torah in the pasuk, the verse Ner Mitzvah v'Torah, which is in context of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, that the soul is compared to a flame, the mitzvah is compared to a flame, and Torah is So after explaining what is, the Atzmi of Torah, that's undiluted and unaffected by a journey into existence, which means in existence, in the Ishtalshelus, we have the very pure as it was pre-Tzimtzum. So like, just to use, I think I may have used this example, in science, they love to be able to find something in traveling and watching a star, for example, that's millions of light years away, or whatever, how far it is. When you go there, it's like seeing events that happened a long time ago, like a fossil of the past. And they always want to be able to find what was happening at the Big Bang, or whatever the earlier stages in history. So lahavdil, you can say Torah is I don't want to call it a fossil, but it's definitely a taste of and an experience of pre-Tzimtzum reality before the Tzimtzum and unaffected by the Tzimtzum. And that is the gift that God gave us in Torah. In Torah itself, we've been learning there's two levels of Oyer. The Oyer of Torah Shebiksav, Oyer Yashar, which is given, the Gedushas Ha'esi, the very letters of the Sefer Torah, is the Oyer Yashar of Torah Shebiksav, which is an Oyer Atzmi. And then there's Oyer Chezer, the refractive light, Momata Lamayla, that is developed and emerges through our learning of the Torah and our processing, and what he calls the birur of Torah Shebal Peh. Where Torah Shebal Peh, in the study, we are clarifying and separating and figuring out how to align this material world, as he said in Daimim Tzemeach Chai Medaber, every aspect, every fiber of existence, to align it with godliness. And what we learned yesterday was that's why Shas, the Shishas Sdarim, Shishas Siddur Mishnah, Shishas Sdarim, the 6 orders of the Talmud, which include Mishnah and Talmud and Gemara. Moyed, as he said, Zroim, Moyed, Nezikin, and then the last 3. The order that he did was Kotshim, Taris, and Noshim. Each one deals with, in the general categories, of different parts of reality. Like he said, Zroim deals mostly with Sameach, the world of vegetation. The Moyed, he didn't apply it to one of the kingdoms of the 4 Daimim Sameach Chai Medaber, but the Zikin is Dinei Mominus. He called that Dinei Mominus, which is connected primarily with the property that people have, especially the animals. So it deals with Elam Achai, like he said, Sher Chamer. Kotshim is Karbonis, which is both Chai and Sameach. And finally, the Taris. So what did he type? Taris. He didn't connect Taris to any particular category. And Noshim, he said, is Bechelek HaMedaber. But bottom line is that the Torah Shebal Peh, its role is the birur, a birur. Torah Shebiksav, the role is not birur. When you read Torah Shebiksav, you're getting God's holy words exactly as Hashem said them, and that's what we receive. Mamay Lamata. It's in Torah Shebal Peh where we are working hard, immersing ourselves in all the different in the darkness of this world where we don't have clarity, to achieve clarity what the Torah would say, what to do or what not to do in every given situation, as we learned. Shekol zeh, he concluded, is nikra b'chinas bitter hapselis. This is all the bitter hapselis, the separating of the waste, because that's what halach in Torah Sheba'al Peh does. It tells you what is tamei, what is tahir, what's pure, what's impure, what's kosher, what's not kosher, what's allowed. In other words, you're extracting that which is allowed to be turned into kedusha, and that which is meant to be discarded or avoided. That's the whole point of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Bitter hapselis bizdachus ha'achruris, in the refining of the dust of the sediment, min hachemer, from chemer, from the crass matter of this world. Through that it will be pure and clean. So that is Torah Sheba'al Peh. And as he said earlier, that's a chidush gadol that Torah Sheba'al doesn't have. Torah Sheba'al is not being mechadash anything. All it is giving us what Hashem wants us. It's Hashem's Torah, like he said. Ein zeh chidush, because you're not transforming the material world. You're illuminating and showing that the Torah is not affected by the tumah of this world. So it is achievement that you're revealing that. But where's the chidush take place? The bitter of chezer of chachma tata, chidush gomer mikore, because you're taking a dark reality on its own. Who knows what a person would do, and can do things that are destructive, that are completely antithetical to godliness, and you're turning that world into a dira b'tachtenim, into a home for God, or the words he used there, an akeli telekus. You're taking a physical world and akeli telekus. That is unprecedented. Torah Sheba'al is revealing in a dark world what Hashem wants, but the actual transformation part is the bitter of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now remember, Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's still telling us, it's still the clarity that halacha provides. It's not the action of a mitzvah, but it's telling us what the mitzvah is and what a mitzvah says, what a mitzvah leisa says, and so on. Like he actually used that expression. I pointed that out. That is teaching us this. But it's a birur because you're getting the clarity of exactly what should be done, what should not be done. And obviously, you can't do mitzvahs if you don't know what to do or what not to do. So you first need the Torah Sheba'al Peh to create that birur. That's essentially what we have learned. And one final part to the end of the paragraph that we finished the paragraph. Let me just say, I was looking for a particular lashon. Okay. Yeah. Where he said, he said on page 412, it's like refining the chemer. At the end of the day, remember, Torah Sheba'al Peh is telling us how to refine the chemer. But you still have to go ahead and bake the matzah. You still have to put on the tefillin. You still have to create the tefillin. But that's implementing. But once you have the full instructions, it's like once the architect gives you the full blueprint, now it's a matter of just simply executing. But the birur is happening in Torah Sheba'al Peh because it's giving us the exact clarity of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, how to take an animal, which animal to use for a carbon, which is not supposed to be used, and all the details of preparing and priming this world to make it a keli telekus. Okay, the last piece, going back to the comparison of Torah Sheba'al and Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yesterday, when I was reading it, I wasn't sure immediately where he goes with Kamosh Kosev the difference between Kedusha and Tara. Was he referring to the Shishas Dorim? Because it seemed like to me, Kedusha and Tara, Kochim and Taras. But it's very clear that that's not the case. That the second, from a Kamosh Kosev which according to some manuscripts shouldn't even be in a parentheses. So I would like to just basically eliminate the parentheses. He explains the difference between Torah Sheba'al and Torah Sheba'al Peh. This Malmayla Lamata, the light that shines, and the light that is created from transforming, from clarifying, from the birur of Torah Sheba'al Peh, he says is like the difference between Kedusha and Tara. Kedusha is be'etzem aviyoseh, something is Kodesh. Be'etzem aviyoseh, like for example, the Torah gives an example, abchir, a firstborn, whether it's for humans or animals or even in Semeach, the first fruit. So by Torah established that will always be something Kodesh. You could do Pidyon Haben, and you can do pidyon, and you can do peter chamer, There are ways to so-called free it from its kedusha state, so to speak, but it's established as kedusha. So they think Shabbos is a yom kodesh. You can't change that. It's betulda by birth, basically. From the moment that Hashem designated that yom hashvi, vayikadesh, He sanctified the seventh day. So that means be'etzem aviyusei. It's not you didn't make it kodesh, but then there's a person who goes and says, "I'm designating something to be holy or to be pure." That he calls tara. It's not like a radiant light, for example, a star. A star is a bright star. You don't have to put light into a star. It is naturally a bright star. And the same thing he said, Evan Hashayam, a luminous stone. Tara, on the other hand, is lahetziatev gamin hara. When you say you metayr something, it's like, for example, kashering an oven. So kashering an oven, the stove is not kodesh in the beginning. It's not. It needs to be. It needs to be. It needs to be cleansed. You need to be kasher it through hot fire or whatever the ways that you do it. And when you do it, you're being meitzah the tev. You're drawing out the good from the ra. L'zachar chagashmis ke'evin yashpa. I didn't look up yet the difference between shem and yashpa in this case, but apparently it means like a stone that's not naturally bright or luminous, but a stone that you polished and you caused it to be luminous. So that's Er Yosher and Er Chezer. This is the difference between Er Yosher of Teresh B'Ksav with the Asius of Teresh B'Ksav compared to Mashpia, and the Asius of Teresh B'Peh, which is compared to Makabel. So the Mashpia, this is the Hashem here, saying the words as he wishes. The Teresh B'Peh is also ultimately divine, but it's through the words of the Tanoim and Amoraim as they discuss. Like we said, Teresh B'Peh, Chochmeh B'Dibur. It's more the dibur, not the chokhmah in its root, chokhmah law. And he said this is the difference between man and mad and man. Hamshach is mayim tchurin, like the zocher, the mashpia. That, in a physical sense, what does that provide? The Talmud, the Gemara tells us the bones, the atzmius, the skeleton of the child, and the man, the mayin nukvin, the feminine, the energy provides the basar v'gidim ve'varim. They're basically the whole structure, not the etzem, the bones and the core, but the whole development of, we call the and basar is the skin and the flesh, and the gidim and the nerves and the limbs. So in a way, it's like he doesn't say it here, but some places the difference between chachma and bina, for example, abba ve'ima, chachma and bina. Bina fleshes it out in detail. That's already a birur of breaking down all the details. Chochmah is giving you the core idea like in a seed, literally like the seed of a male seed, but that fertilizes an egg, and there the child is developed in the mother's womb into a full-blown, a full-dimensional child. So basically, that's the difference between Mashpia and Makabel, and he finally compares the difference between Avonim and Levanim. Stones are created as stones, and Levanim are man-made stones. What does that mean? Man-made bricks, I should say, that are made out of, he says, from offer, from dirt, meaning offer means from matter, from materials, usually whether it's dirt from the earth or mixed with other objects, and then it's put into an oven, like he says, bekifshon, and you create a brick. So one is mamay lamata, one is created as an oven, as even, a stone, and one is shaped and manufactured. And that's the difference between the Avonim and Levanim, similar to the idea of Er Yosher and Er Chezer, Tilam Levena Le'even. The Aces, the Teresh B'Ksav, is called Avonim. The letters of the written Torah are called like stones, because they're Er Atzmi, they're like the Er Atzmi, like a stone is Ba'etzem, a stone as it's created as such. The Aces, the Teresh B'Peh, and the letters of the oral Torah are compared to Levena, which is manufactured through a person's learning Torah, and the bitter that comes shemedabrim bebriya bebir habruyim datzach, or shemedvarim. Yesterday, it could be both medabrim or medvarim. Medabrim means they speak about the bitter of all the creations of Daim and Sameach Chai, like we learned earlier, which is essentially the theme of Teresh B'Peh. Now, as I said, the parentheses, I would eliminate the first parenthesis, and Hashem Chulu, and the second parenthesis is fine, is Er Yosher and Er Chezer. That's a summation of what we learned yesterday. So now we understand Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh. Before I continue, I want to just point out a few things that I think helpful in this whole discussion. First of all, I want to go back to Torah the Alter Rebbe, the source material for this. Because like we saw earlier, when we looked into Torah and we spoke earlier about the Torah being Atzmi, Atzmi, we saw in Torah in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, it's very brief, but you see clearly that the Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe is developing the ideas, and the same thing here. Why did the Mittler Rebbe go into a whole arichas, into distinguishing written Torah and oral Torah? Because when you look in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, he talks about it, but he speaks about it very briefly. And when you see the Mittler Rebbe, you see the depth, and you can understand the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe in a completely different way. I learned the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe first, and I did not understand it quite until after the Mittler Rebbe explains it. Then you understand why the Alter Rebbe is saying what he's saying. So I'd like to go back to the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and just point that out, because I believe that will also help us go back to Ayin Beis and understand how this plays itself out in the themes of Ayin Beis. Remember, in Ayin Beis, we already, at the end of Ayin Beis concluded long before this theme here. The end of Ayin Beis concluded with the Yichud of Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, in the contemplation of Shema, that brings us to Vahafta, that brings us to the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, transforming the animal soul. Even that was not finished in Ayin Beis. He never got back to the animal soul. He definitely did not get back to Ner Mitzvah and Torah. So we are now is much further, but it's very much connected to the essential theme that Ayin Beis begins to discuss on page 1350 of what is Torah. What is Torah in contrast to mitzvahs and in contrast to neshama? All that is discussed on 1350. He just never got back to it. So I think that the more we learn what we're learning now from the Mittler Rebbe and sourced from the Alter Rebbe will help us understand the entire picture of Ayin Beis, where he compares Torah to Tefillah, Mamayla Lamata, Mamat Lamayla. We clearly see these words, Mamayla Lamata, Mamat Lamayla here. The two, Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. Before we go to the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, I wanted to point out that this theme, this idea of Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh, and in general, as we pointed out, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, is discussed directly earlier in Ayin Beis in volume 3. I still have to look at it a little more in depth to see, but it seems to me that part of that may be very much sourced in this Maimer as well. So even though it's an earlier part of Ayin Beis, but we've seen that the Mittler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe Rashab, has used this Maimer several times throughout the entire structure. So I want to point out to you on page 1377, if you want to look it up, you can, in Ayin Beis volume 3, he speaks specifically about the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah, and compares it to Chachmei Law and Chachmei Tata, and how they communicate with each other, these two parts of the Torah. So as I said, I'm going to read it more in depth on my own, and I'll get back to you with more information, but I just felt it was important to mention, because as I said, at the end of the day, we are learning the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer because of Ayin Beis. So if he's talking about this very idea in Ayin Beis, it would be worthwhile reading in there. Now, in Ayin Beis, it's very clear that when you learn it, it helps us understand some of the points here in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, in actually understanding what Torah Shebal Peh contributes. So if you look in that, I said page 1377, 1378, Chachmei Law and Chachmei Tata of Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh. And as I said, I will get back to it. Actually, he even talks about the Shisha Masechtas, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. So I just wanted to point that out. And just a second, quickly. Okay. So we'll get back to that at some point. What I'd like to do, unless somebody has any questions, before we continue on, I want to go back to the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and just point out what the Mittler Rebbe is elaborating on. So like basically grounding it back into the source of the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. But if someone has a question, I'm happy to answer before I do that. Okay. So bear in mind that in the elaborate elaboration and the length of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer sometimes can be like a forest, which you can get lost in, or let's call it a sea, actually, a Rechev Sanar, expansive river. And it's important to understand that the central themes of this Maimer are a few key points. He's elaborating at length about Torah. But why is he coming to explain to us Torah? Because in the original themes that he discussed, was first we spoke about how a soul is compared to a candle and illuminates with the three aspects of the candle. The wick being the divine soul that immerses itself in the oil, which is the wisdom of the animal soul, of human intelligence, transforming it into fuel that will create a divine fiery love and flame. That's the candle of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, which is, in the words of Shema, the contemplation of Achdus Hashem will affect and permeate and then train and harness the animal soul to also love God and feel connected. Even though on its own, the animal soul is oil of its own, which serves its own needs. That was the first key point in the Maimer and the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. Then he said, but now let's compare it to the next verse, Ner Mitzvah V'Teireh. How does that add to the equation? And he explained in the Maimer and the Alter Rebbe, and the Mittler Rebbe elaborates, that Ner Mitzvah is also called a candle because a mitzvah is also manifests in the physical world, it takes physical objects and turns them into mitzvahs, the Ratzon Hashem. And it has a special zgula to also help refine the animal soul, as he explained, again, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And the length, Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvesov, the power of mitzvahs to do so. So a mitzvah now adds whatever the neshama does on its own. With a mitzvah, it takes it to a whole other level of the refinement of the animal soul. But then there's the next part of the pasuk, Torah. What does Torah add? So now he's saying Torah adds the atzmi. And actually, he's in the middle of a question that he never fully answered yet, which is, what is a mitzvah without Torah? It seems from the pasuk that a mitzvah is only a candle that doesn't have light. When a mitzvah itself is 620 pillars of light, like he said. It itself is the Ratzon Atzmi of the Eibishter. So we'll get back to the answer. But we're in the middle of the discussion that Torah introduces Atzmi. Now we've learned that Torah goes further than that. Not just Torah Atzmi, the Atzmi comes into the post-Tzimtzum reality. And more than that, the Torah Shabbat Peh actually gives the power to be the birur of this physical world. This is going to lead us back to mitzvahs, because at the end of the day, mitzvahs are basically what we derive from Torah Shabbat Peh. Like I mentioned before, this birur of, let's say, what kind of korban you should bring and what form you bring it, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. The same thing in all the 6 orders, whether it's in the matters of agricultural whether it's Peah or like you said, or Trumas or Mises and so on. And the same thing in Moyed, the laws of Shabbos and Yontif. The same thing in the area of Nezikin, damages and litigation and so on. And then the other 3, Kochim, which is about Karbonis and the sacred items that we bring as offerings. And then Taris, about Tuma and Tara. And then finally Noshim, matters of marriage and marital law and so on. All of that ends up being translated into mitzvahs. All the mitzvahs come from Torah Shabbat Peh, which is based on Torah Shabbat. So but now, what's the Torah's contribution? Why not just mitzvahs alone? Because mitzvahs just tells you what to do. Torah Shabbat Peh is teaching you God's methodology. The birur, you're clarifying how God wants us to do it. So we're not just implementing like a servant implements what God wants. We are part of the process. We're like partners in the process of understanding what to do. And then comes the mitzvah, which is the implementation of it. So Torah basically plays the role of Torah Yashar, of Torah Shebiksav. That tells us what God wants. And the basis of it all, Yashar. Torah Shabbat Peh is the process, the arduous process, and the strenuous process of exerting ourselves and studying and arguing and discussing and entering into the darkness of this world to clarify till we get a birur exactly what to do. And a mitzvah will be the implementation. We haven't learned that yet. So that's really the general context of this whole mimer, of all this arichas. So to help contextualize, I want to go back to the mimer and the Alter Rebbe, because there, everything is a lot briefer, and you see only the main points. But you'll also see literally the brilliance and the go'enus of the Mittler Rebbe, how he took a few lines from the Alter Rebbe and turned it into this elaborate discussion. But at the same time, like with Kach, Chachma, and Bina, the Mittler Rebbe is like Bina, the Alter Rebbe is like Chachma, but as much as Bina is necessary, you always want to ground it and have like a reality check to go back to the point of departure of Chachma. What are the main nekudas, which is what I just did now. Because you can, again, get lost in the woods here or lost at sea if you don't really realize that you need the anchors, the coordinates, I should say, and the anchors that really give us the picture. So, with your permission, I want to go back to the Maimon Alter Rebbe. You don't have to follow along the text if you don't like. If you want to follow the text again, is at ayambase.com. But I'll just point out a few key lines, both in the Maimer and the Beer of the Maimer, which will help us contextualize this whole Mittler Rebbe's arichas. So I hope what I said was clear, and I'll try to clarify even more. So I'm going back now to the Maimer and Torah Eir. This is the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. We are on I'm looking now at page 38C and D, and also 39B. Those are the two places, the main places I'm looking at right now. So I'm going to read a few select lines that you'll see the context. So after explaining Ner Mitzvah, that Ner Mitzvah is like we learned, like the makiv, like the embrace, the makiv, the levush of mitzvahs, like the talis and film that embraces us. In God's embrace, Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvaysav. Then he says, Ach teire eir, hu amshachas eirein sev baruch hu momayla lamata. Because mitzvahs, at the end of the day, as we've discussed, is a combination of momayla lamata and mamata lamayla. Mamayla lamata, because God gave us these mitzvahs. But mamat lamayla, because we perform them from the physical world, physical objects of this world. Torah is primarily, if not exclusively, mamayla lamata. Torah is not a process from the bottom up. Even though we're going to learn in a moment that Torah Shabbat Peh is in Torah itself, but generally Torah is God revealing to us His Torah. Then He's giving us Torah Shabbat Peh to develop it. So Torah, the Torah Shabbat Peh has in it a mamata lamayla as well, as we're going to learn. But generally, it's amshachas erein say baruch hu mamayla lamata. Uru er v'gili erein say baruch hu mamish shalamayla mayla meishtal shalus. That this is the er v'gili of erein sof that's higher, much higher than ishtal shalus. As we learned at length, the Mittler Rebbe explained the Eir before the Tzimtzum, which the Alter Rebbe actually also says later on 39A and B. Okay, and this Eir L'Mal Mishtalshlus, Sheyiridus v'Hadrogas Seder Shtalshlus B'chinas Helem, V'Yislapshus Erein Sei Baruch Hu, Lias Yisavus Muhus Achar Muhus Beifanim Uminim Sheni. The Eir, the Shtalshu, the air that the divine energy that enters into the cosmic order, that goes gradations and concealments, and it manifests level by level from one muhus to the next muhus, muhus achar muhus, one personality to another. In other words, it's creating the definitions and structures of existence. He established darkness as his hiding place, as his place. This is the tzimtzum, the helam that creates existence, and that helam, in there is a divine energy, but it's concealed. That the world is based as predicated on a concealment. Because if the divine energy was completely unfiltered and not concealed, no existence could emerge. No independent consciousness, like the words of the Eitz Chaim. That's why we need the tzimtzum. But al-teira nemar, megala amukis min necheshech. Torah comes to reveal the amukis, the depths of all the different minecheshach within the darkness. Torah is Torah. It's a revealing force, not a concealing force. And like we learned that the Mittler Rebbe explained that it's not just a revealing force, that it's not subject to tzimtzum even. So it all is about revealing the inner depths, like we learned at length, all the deeper secrets. Then he goes on. and this is the purpose of the creation of man. If left at its own, to its own accord, so God created existence through concealing his divine energy, and that's that. If nothing else happens, you have an existence, the 6 days of creation. You have an entire world created by God, but you don't have divine revelation in this world. At least not the way it should be. So God created a human being. And he said, he placed them in the garden and said, your job is to tend to this garden and to make it grow and blossom and manifest and reveal the Eid Ein Sof Shalamayla Mishtalshus. The Eid Ein Sof in existence is the Eid Ein Sof in Ishtalshus. So of course, every Daimim Tzemeach Chai Medaber is created by God and does not defy God's will. Only a human being has free will to do so. But a human being also has the power to reveal the Eid Ein Sof Lamayla Mishtalshus into existence. And how do you do that? Through Torah. Liyes Eid Ein Sof Baruch Hu Sheda Lamata. This is the function and the purpose of a human being, to bring down this Eid Ein Sof, that it should reside, Sheda, it should reside, it should dwell below, Kamei Lamayla, exactly as it's above. In Seder Shtalshus, you don't have that. Seder Shtalshus, there's gradations and and there's levels, there's Atzilus, Bria, Sirasiyah, higher and lower. But Haved of a person, and he's going to explain, through Torah, is to reintroduce the divine as it is above. That's how it should be below. Lamata kamei lamayla, kamei shekosav ani rishon v'ani achlim and b'velodai ein elikim. I am the first, I am the last, and b'velodai, without him, there's no God. She explains, kashem shani kalemer, kashem shani rishon kein shanivrela, v'achlim la'achar shanivrelem kein b'velodai dahainu b'mtsoyis b'shaz b'risel ye'erin se baruch hu nimshach lamata. So just as I am the first and I am the end of it all, the last, so too everything in between. The whole Ishtalshlus, Elikim, should also be Nimshach, Bittul Ha'elam B'Metzias, Kamei Kodim Shenivra V'Achar Shenivra. That the whole world should experience an utter sense of nullification, utter sense of sublimation in experiencing the divine unity. B'Hainu Al Yedei Torah. And that's what Torah does. Torah allows us to do that. Without Torah, you only have the structure of existence, so you have the divine energy, but it's concealed, each level according to its commensurate to its level. Torah, which comes from Lamayla Mishtalshus, gives the person, the human being who learns Torah and implements Torah, the ability to bridge and to reconnect and bring down the highest levels of the divine into existence. So just for comparison, later we're going to learn about the role of the neshama and the role of mitzvahs. But just briefly, this adds something, because when a neshama contemplates on Shema and affects the animal soul, that's as much power as a soul has on its own. But a soul, remember, down below is separate from the divine. Even though it's fundamentally one, but it doesn't have enough in its arsenal. It's Torah, well, first mitzvahs, and even more Torah that gives it the power of a gili of Eid Ein Sof L'mayla Mishtalshus. So although the neshama is rooted there, but once the neshama comes down below, it doesn't have a conscious connection. Torah gives it the connection to bring down those highest levels all the way down below. Because Torah comes from Chochmah. All this is, I'm reading from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, but when you read it, you see so many ideas that the Mittler Rebbe developed are based on these lines. Because Torah comes from Chochmah. And what do we learn about Chochmah? If you remember, Koyach Ma, Ayin, it's the interface between Keser and the higher levels of Elikus to existence. Ukamesha Kosev, and here you'll see, if you remember the Mittler Rebbe brought, when he brought Ein Kovid El Torah, if you remember the Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochmah on the top of page 411, and I asked the question, why is he bringing Kovid? Now I see why, because Alter Rebbe brings it. Say Chochmah Lo Torah called Kovid, Ein Kovid El Torah, Yikara Elyon, Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochmah. So the Alter Rebbe says, like it says, L'kfeidei Berosiv, I created it for my honor. What's Kovid? Kovid b'gematria Lamed Beis. Kovid is the same number as 32. Heim Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochmah. Those are the 32 paths of wisdom. So in other words, Kovid, what means L'kfeidei Berosiv? I've created existence for covered, which was referring to the Torah, to the Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochmah, Barasiv Bechinas Talmud, Yitzartev Bechinas Mishnah, Vasisa Bechinas Mikra. So now you see why the Rebbe, Alter Mittler Rebbe, is elaborating on these three levels. He spoke about Mikra, about Talmud, Mishnah, and Mikra. Shekulam hem Bechinas Chochmah. All of them are a level of Chochmah. Whatever level, it's all Torah, is all wisdom. The wisdom of Mikra, of verse, the wisdom of Mishnah, or the wisdom of Talmud. Shekulam Bechinas Chochmah, ve'ein so baruch hu shedu mizgala b'chochmah, she'en shum hester upon him. Like the Mittler Rebbe elaborated on page, just to give you the exact page, on page 408, he said clearly, this is the Klal Yadua, the Ein Ein Sof Sheida Ela B'Chochmah. Why did he say, why is Torah an Atzmi that's undiluted? Because Torah is Chochmah, and Chochmah doesn't have any substance of its own. V'nachnu ayin. Since it has no substance of its own, it's a transparent channel for the divine. This whole piece that he elaborated on is taken from these few lines in the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe. So Chochmah is, like he says, Shedem is Gala b'Chochmah, and Shum Haster Panim. There's no concealment of the Hashem's face in Chochmah. V'shamu b'chinas Ani Hashem le'shanisi, and there you have the level of Ani Hashem le'shanisi, like he said earlier, nothing changes. There's no shini mehus. The Torah, as it comes down below, is exactly as it is above. We have to internalize it. We have to study it and reveal it in our lives. But the Torah remains intact in that sense. So that's the first part of the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe. But then he continues. Because right now, it's not very clear. The concept of Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebapeh was hinted to when he said Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, but he didn't really explain. So now comes the next section in the Maimer, and the Mittler Rebbe, obviously quite sensitive to the deeper understanding of this, that elaborates everything we learned about the written Torah and the oral Torah is taken from this next transition here. So now suddenly the Alter Rebbe moves on and says like this. And when we learned it in Torah, in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, you may recall, I asked the question, why is he bringing this section here? Now it's very clear, because remember, the goal here is not just that Torah comes down below and shines a light that's untouched. Remember, we want a birur. We want to transform the world. We don't just want to reveal godliness into the world. We want to transform the chemer gas, the crass material world, a piece of food from an animal or from or fruits and vegetables or whatever it may be, that food should be elevated and its spark should be freed and refined to become part of godliness. That everything we do, that's a whole different level than just Torah. Because Torah, like we learned at Mittler Rebbe clearly, you can reveal Torah in this world, like Matan Torah, but that doesn't mean the world gets transformed. Since Matan Torah have been thousands of years that we're still working on transforming the world. So where in Torah do you see that? Mitzvahs do that. But where does Torah do that? So that's why the Alter Rebbe continues now and is going to explain that that's done through Torah Shebal Peh. Because Torah Shebal Peh essentially is like an interface between Torah Shebiksav and the mitzvahs that engage with the physical world. If you only have Torah Shebiksav and you only have mitzvahs, you'd basically have a guide, like basically all we have to do is just follow rules. But we wouldn't be processing. We ourselves, a human being, the one who's learning Torah, would not be creating the birur. When you stand now before a Rav or a Bezdin, or you're learning Torah and trying to clarify a nuance or a point, is this object or food kosher lePesach or not? Can you use this in this stove? What's required to make matzah? What passes matzah? Makes it no more matzah, makes it chametz. That process is given to us as well, which is called the learning of Torah Shebal Peh. So if you only had the written Torah, which would be, tell us these are the mitzvahs. So besides the fact that we wouldn't know how to do most of the mitzvahs, like I mentioned, even chametz matzah, the laws of chametz matzah are very, very slim. And you read Torah Shebiksav, you just know that 7 days you're not supposed to eat chametz. But what is chametz? and what makes something chametz, and what's matzah, and how careful do you have to be, and so on and so forth. That requires Torah Sheba'al Peh. But if you only had Torah Shebiksav and mitzvahs, you'd have let's say at best, you'd have an action book, what to do, and you do it. But there'd be none of the processing. We wouldn't become partners to understand God's methodology. Torah Sheba'al Peh, when Hashem taught Moshe Torah Sheba'al Peh, he said, let me teach you how I think, not just what I think. In other words, teaching him how to think, not just what to think, which is a very different experience. That means that we are like one. When we say we love God, that we revere God, we understand God. That's far more than a servant implementing God's rules. That means that we're immersing ourselves and we're understanding, we're trying to, as much as possible. Obviously, and less machshavah tfisa beklal, but that too, Torah teaches us. Torah also teaches us that God is beyond us. That's also part of our understanding. So that whole process is a Torah Sheba'al Peh experience. Now, Torah Shebiksav is obviously the basis. It all starts from there. But Torah Sheba'al Peh is where it really plays itself out in the fullest sense of the word. And that's the next section, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. If you don't learn the Mittler Rebbe, you can wonder, why is he saying it? I mean, you could ultimately figure it out. But you see how the Mittler Rebbe makes it so clear that now we need to understand Torah Sheba'al Peh to really understand how Torah that undiluted light from Atzmi, comes down and helps us transform this world. And that's the process that he continues to read. I'm going to continue to read now in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. And I hope you see now why I'm doing this, because it's so vital to understand the whole context of what we've been learning. So he says now like this, Ulechein, now that we've established that Torah comes down into this world, Barasav, Yitzar Bri, Sirasiya, which he compared to Talmud, Mishnah, and Mikra. And it's all comes down to Chvedi, through Chachma, and therefore doesn't have any concealment. It's Atzmi exactly as it is above, that's how it is below. Now he says, Ulechein Rabbi Yehuda, the Kula Tenuya ben Nezikin Hava, Lezaka says Lezaka, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda was a great sage in the Talmud. So it says Kula Tenuya ben Nezikin. His entire, basically his expertise was in the Zikin. Nizikin is the laws of damages. That what? Who Lezaka says Azakai. So Nizikin, we know, a big part of Nizikin is when you have an argument or disagreement between partners, between neighbors, between employer and employee, all those laws, all employment law, all litigation law, all damages laws, and so on. So Rabbi Yehuda was an expert in that area. Kula Tanuya, his entire learning was in the Zikin. Means that was his primary, everyone has their particular expertise. There are those that are experts in Hilchos Nashim, there are experts in Tumah V'Tada. His was Nizikin. Lezaka says Azakai, Ulechayev is Achayev. To give merit to the one that deserves merit, and to hold responsible the one that's responsible. So when two people come and one says, your animal, or you infringed on my property, you caused me damage. So Rabbi Yehuda was the expert to determine, ask the right questions, look at evidence, listen to witnesses, and clarify a birur, who's chayev, who's zakai, who's chayev, who's merit, and who's responsible, and who's guilty, so to speak. Lahafrid beinayim. And the job is to separate, because initially, you don't know who's right. Both are arguing. Both are making arguments. They both may even be persuasive argument and the case that they make. But you need someone to clarify, to separate what's the schus and what's the who's zakeh and who's chayev. B'chdei lahafrid hachitzenim, in the language of Chassidus, that means lahafrid hachitzenim ha'kedusha. To separate the chitzenim is the language Chassidus used for the outer. It means for the excess, for the negative energy. You say unikas achitzenim, that the outer forces. It's a let's call it a subtle way of referring to negative forces. The hafrid hachitzenim ha'kedusha. V'yispardu kol poelei oven. to separate the Chitzenim from the Kedusha, because here somebody is not telling the truth. Something is wrong here, and you have to figure out which is right, which is wrong, which means you have to extract the truth from a situation that's confusing or contradictory. The Yispad Kol Peile Oven, which means all those that Peile Oven are those that, all criminals, or all those that cause harm. Yispardu should be separated. Yispardu from the word pirud, meaning this means to separate, to identify them. Because the worst thing is when evil is mixed among the good, and you can't know who's right and who's wrong. Because the person who's the criminal is mixing himself into the righteous ones, and you can't separate between them. That's the job. Okay, so what is the Alter Rebbe doing here? So when you read it on its own without the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, you say, why is he bringing this? Okay, so we can figure out, now we can for sure figure it out. Because he's saying how Torah creates this clarity. But when you understand that there's two levels of Ur, Torah Yashar, and Torah Shabapeh Chezer, Torah Shabiksav Yashar, Torah Shabapeh Chezer, which enters into a world of Nezikin, where there are arguments and there's a cheshech and the things are not clear. Rabbi Yehuda epitomizes that, so now you understand the whole context here, because he's trying to explain how Torah comes even into these darker places. And then he continues, that's why Rabbi Yehuda was absolved and free from davening. Because the Fishoisa Teiraso Menase, his whole business, his whole Menase means his work, was Torah. He didn't just learn Torah. Torah was like his complete preoccupation. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, like Rashbi, Shimon Bar Yochai, and V'cheverov and his colleagues. Teiraso Menase, we're told, the Torah tells us, is Potem min Atfilah, except Krishma, which we'll mention soon. Why was he Poter? Because Rabbi Yehuda was a tremendously great man. Ad she'omer alav Shmuel, to the point that Shmuel said about him, Ein ze yelud isha. This is not like a person born to a woman, meaning he's like essentially like a godly person. Obviously, he had a mother, but it means that his stature was such, he wasn't of a regular flesh and blood, so to speak. Because the reverence of God is upon him. Because he had upon him the bitl of Ein Sof Baruch Hu. What's the point he wants to make here? That even in a world of Nezikin, he brought down Torah exactly as it is. Like we said, Chochmah, total bitl. He had bechinas bitl Ein Sof Baruch Hu shehim shechalov b'krishma, which he drew down by Krishma. And I remember earlier in the Maimer, he talks about Krishma, Shema, of the neshama contemplating on Shema and being mamshich that, Baruch Shem, into the animal soul. So that's somewhat of a connection. Ki mina Krishma lo yahya poter, because he was not poter from Krishma. He was poter from the rest of davening, but not from Shema. Va'afilu Rab Shimon ben Yochai v'chaverov, and also Rab Shimon ben Chaver and his colleagues were also not poter, absolved from saying Shema. Elaminat tefillah. They were only absolved from davening. Why? Because their whole life was immersed in Torah, complete bittul. When you have such bittul, the whole purpose of tefillah is to create bittul, but they already had the bittul through Shema and through the Torah that they learned. And his Torah was also in a form of this utter selflessness. And the level of v'asem dvarei, that I have placed my words in your mouth. So it's one thing you learn Torah, you're reading a passage or a verse or an idea in Torah, so your mouths are saying the debartabam, you're speaking the words of Torah. Asem dvarei b'ficha means when your bitl is so deep that you become a transparent channel, like we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was just God's mouthpiece. Misam pel adam, asem dvarei b'ficha. I've placed my words in your mouth. Your mouth is just uttering and channeling my words, Hashem's words. But dvari asher samte beficha. Another pasuk that says similarly, my words that I've placed in your mouth. So what do you see from this? So Rabbi Yehuda, his bittul was such that when he learned Torah, he was simply channeling godliness without any any shift, no shinui, exactly what we're learning, but it's not just Torah, but and that's why he's able to bring into Nezikin that type of clarity. Because if the Torah gets diluted in any way, how do you know? You could say the clarity of Torah is in Torah. The clarity of Torah is in higher worlds. How do you know you can come into a dark world and achieve clarity and know exactly what God wants? Maybe you can't. But when you have people like Rabbi Yehuda, and who call it Tanui ben Nezikin, so because he is a transparent channel of Chachma, for Osa and Dvari Beficha, that's why he's capable of doing that.
The recording stopped.
I see. The reason is because I think we ran out of disk space. So if you give me a moment, let me just clear up a little disk space so we can continue the recording. 1 second, please. Perfect timing, huh?
Indeed.
I didn't realize we're in such low space here. Let's see here. Give me a moment. We'll get it. Okay, this one. One. Okay, I think I should have enough here. Just checking. At least it warned us. That's good. Okay, I think we have enough for now. I'll start a new recording and we'll have a second part. Okay. Well, we don't have enough. We don't have a lot of time anyway left, but okay. Here we go.
So there'll be two YouTubes?
The YouTube is just going to continue. The YouTube is fine because that's live stream. Doesn't need memory. So the YouTube should be fine with this little break here, but there won't be two YouTubes. On my local computer, I'm going to have to, it's got two parts because of the recording.
I see.
Okay, so continue where I left off. I think I just want to, yeah, okay. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda was completely saturated, completely with his bitl that he had. That's why he's put him in tefillah, which is interesting because earlier we spoke about tefillah Shema. Okay, we'll talk about that more later. Asr dvarei b'ficha, but here is interesting. He brings a Kamaim Razal. I'm continuing the Maim of the Alter Rebbe. Masnisin Malkusa. You may remember we just learned this in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, that the Mishnah is compared to a queen. To not just to a servant, to a queen. Masnisin Malkusa. He said this on Torah Shebal Peh. If you look on page 411 from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, he said, that the second level in Torah Shebal Peh, is Malchus, Masnisin Malchusa. And now we understand why. Because he's coming to explain this Maimon Alter Rebbe, because we're talking about Torah Shebal Peh. But here's the interesting piece now. B'chinas Melech, Shemitzava v'gezer, Shayi hapsak kach. So the Torah that we learn, we're not just fulfilling God's will. When we learn Torah, we become like a melech, like the melech himself. Because who passes all these laws? Who orders them all? What's the word I want to say? Then when a king establishes law, it's called something. I forgot what it's called. Whatever. So
Dictate?
Yeah, dictate, whatever. Mitzvah v'gezer. When a melech is mitzvah v'gezer, he basically establishes a law. He commands his people something. Sheyia psak kach, that the psak, meaning the ruling, should be so and so. Ki melech b'mishpat yamid oretz. Because a melech, how does he establish his nation, his people, his country, his empire? B'mishpat, with law. If a king doesn't have laws, he can't have order in his land. It'll be chaos, anarchy. So melech b'mishpat yamid oretz, lezakas as azakai, to give merit to the one that deserves merit, and hold accountable the one that did something wrong. That's the basis of every country that is going to be civil and civilized, that it needs to have laws. So in our case, Torah is compared to a melech, because the melech, the Torah is God's basically law book. It's his constitution. Sheyesh beis b'chinas. So he says now that Alter Rebbe says there's two levels in this Torah. B'chinas eved shalemid. The level of a servant who learns Torah. Kedei sheyada rotzen hamelech. So a servant is learning, the subject is learning to know what does the king want. So he reads the constitution of the king, the constitutional laws, so he knows what the king wants. But there's another level, b'chinas melech. Shebe'es limudei, that the person who's learning is in a state of being like a king. Masnisin malchusa, the Mishnah is like a melech. He's in a state of shebe'es limudei, that when he's learning, hu hagezer u'mitzav la'atzmei. It's like the melech himself learning, and he's himself dictating and decreeing, and mitzav la'atzmei, as if to himself, that this is the laws that I myself am binding myself to. In other words, when a Jew learns Torah, you can learn Torah two ways. You could be a recipient, like a servant, a subject that wants to know what God wants. You want to learn what the Ratzon HaMelech is. Or you can be like a king yourself, like a king, like we say, Idin our B'nai Melachim or Melachim Heim, where we're comparable. In a sense, we're learning as if we're learning that the person is like a partner with God in the establishing these decrees, which is, of course, the whole process of Torah Shebal Peh. Hashem says, I want you to make the psak. We know the famous Gemara, where there was a disagreement between Mesivta de Rekia, the academy in heaven, and Mesivta de Kushabricha, the academy of God. They disagreed about something. So they said, how are we going to come to a decision? So they sent down to ask Rabbi Bar Nachmani. Said, why? If God is learning Torah, does he need to ask a human being for clarity? Because it says, Torah le b'shamayim. The Torah was given below, we paskin. Hashem wants us to paskin the halacha. Obviously, based on the methodology that the Torah provides. We don't just do whatever we want. But at the end of the day, we have to find that clarity. And he paskin not like Mesivta de Kudshabricha. The Gemara in Baba Metzia says this. He paskin like the other academy. And Hashem responds, Hashem chayech, it says Hashem smiled and said, Natschuni boni natschuni. My child has prevailed over me, he has prevailed. Natschuni boni natschuni. Prevailed, my son, you've prevailed. In other words, he disagreed and overruled even Hashem. Obviously, we're not talking about atzmus and levels that are completely beyond. We're talking about how Hashem manifests in these levels. So you see here, not just a servant and a king, that we're like a partner. So he says that Vayzeu shekosa vayhi b'shurin melech, and this is what it means vayhi b'shurin melech haMoshe. Lefi sheshchina hoyse medaberes mitegreina shel Moshe. Moshe is compared to a king. This is the glory of Moshe, because the Shekhinah like spoke through his throat, like we said before. Asim dvarei beficha, through the throat of Moshe. V'kach Rab Shimon bar Yochai v'chaveirov, and the so similar is the level of Rab Shimon bar Yochai and his colleagues. But Rab Yehuda lefi madregosei, and Rab Yehuda according to his level, basically distinguishing. Obviously, they're not all on the same level, but each on their level were channels for the divine wisdom, for the divine Torah and the divine words. Shekafi erech bittul nafshi le'erein sof baruch hu, commensurate to the level of bittul to erein sof baruch hu. Kacha haisa hamshachas erein sof baruch hu b'teirasam avedasam. In direct proportion to their bittul was the way they were mamshich erein sof through their Torah, in their Torah and in their service avedasam. And the Mishnah that came through their mouth, that they spoke with their mouths, is mamish dvar Hashem. And that's what causes that the bittul of the world should be bittul b'mitzias lamata, even below, even in this world of darkness of nizikin, just as it is above, is because the Bali Torah Shebal Peh, Moshe, Rashbi, his colleagues, Rabbi Yehuda, they were channels of this bittul through Torah Shebal Peh. Now the Alter Rebbe doesn't even mention Torah Shebal Peh once, if I recall here. He speaks about it, but the Mittler Rebbe took this and developed the whole idea of the difference between written Torah and oral Torah, and talks about the chidush of oral Torah. And I think even this word, this Kefi Erech Bittul Nafshe, was also written. I think the Mittler Rebbe wrote something. That's the way the Hamshach, the bottom of page 410. Now, because of time, I don't want to, there's more to say, but this is the piece I wanted to read. And you start seeing now the connection between the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and how it all begins to shine clearly. So I'm going to stop here. We didn't learn any new thing in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, but we did review and we did connect it. I showed you where it is in Ayin Beis on the pages, and most importantly, we learned the connection to the Alter Rebbe's original Maimer. So I'll stop here. Are there any questions? Okay.
Just to clarify, when he said that essentially the dictates of the Gemara, as brought down by Chazal, are essentially, I don't know, more godly, if you will, than I guess some lower manifestation of God himself, because what? The neshama is rooted higher than, let's say, Shem Elohim, for example. I mean, what's going on there? He's glorifying Chazal as if they're decreeing literally like God. And so I'm trying to understand, number one, clarify that's what he said. And number two, why is that? Is that because of the neshama? I mean, what's going on there?
First of all, I wouldn't sum up the way you did at all, what he said here. He basically, to use the words of the Mittler Rebbe, let's look at the words. He said like this, that
by the way, I don't have the text in front of me, so forgive me. I had to step away.
Okay, but I'll read the text. He says like this.
Yeah.
The Afal the Chochmet the lower wisdom, Mekabelis, receives from Chochmei law of Torah Shebiksav. It has a root that's higher because it reaches all the way into the Etzem. Whereas Torah Eir is the highest level of Eir. And then he compares it to Baal Tshuva over at Tzaddik a little later. The reason being because it refines the darkness itself, where Torah Shebiksav does not. So I don't see there anything here about higher than God at all. We're talking here two levels in Torah. Both come from the same God. God gave Torah Eir, And he gave two dimensions in Torah. One, he reveals in Torah Shebiksav the basics, and that's Mamaya Lamata. The second, he taught the methodology, God's methodology. He taught us. Like the story I mentioned with Rabbi Bar Nachmani, he said, and I want you to paskin, and I will even follow your psak, because it's similar to the idea that why when we come down, we make a dira dafkin tachtenim. In the higher worlds, you have giluyim, you have a lot of revelation. But if you want to have the highest levels of the divine from the etzem, it comes down dafka when the human being comes into this world and transforms the darkness into light. And that in Torah itself is Torah Shebapeh compared to Torah Shebiksav. That's the way I would sum up what he says here.
Yeah, no, I thank you. I understand that. There was a few phrases there where there was some comparison, and I think it was a certain Amora, and he said, he's prevailed over my arguments, that his analysis
of the Gemara Baba Metzia, yeah.
Well, so the Eibishter said that his analysis is better than what I have. Like, he's right. Yeah?
Because I'm giving the Torah down below, and I want them to clarify. And when they do, you could also prevail over God's wisdom, so to speak. God himself is giving us that ability to do that because he gave the Torah down below and wants us to work with that Torah. So I don't know if you recall, in Ayin Beis, there's a whole part where he talks about that as well. How the Chazal could at times even overrule a law in the Torah at times. But it's not for now. This is a longer discussion that we already have had a number of times, but I'll be happy to talk about it, but I'd rather do it in another class.
No, that's fine. You gave me enough of a clarification for now. Thank you.
I'm going to stop here. So we're still on page 413, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. We learned the Torah today, 38 C and D. I still want to go over a few other things. We'll do that in the next.